everyone, my name's Caitlin. You're going to be hearing from my partner Katrina later on in the video, and today we're going to be discussing Chapter 35. Chapter 35 is about the standpoint theory of Sandra Harding and Julia Wood. To understand a standpoint theory, you need to know what a standpoint is. A standpoint is a place from which to view the world around us and suggest a specific location in time and space where that observation takes place. Harding and Wood believe that one of the best ways to discover how the world works is to view it from the standpoint of women or other marginalized groups. They also believe that the social groups we're in powerfully shape how we experience and understand the world. Let's use a metaphor to understand this. Picture a pond with a stick in it. From where you're standing, the stick looks bent. But if you view the stick from a different location, you'll see that it's actually straight. It only looks bent because of light refraction. Much like how light refraction influences your perspective of the stick in the pond, your standpoint can be impacted by inequalities of gender, race, class, and sexual orientation. Harding claims that when people speak from opposite sides of power relations, the perspective from the lives of the less powerful can provide a more objective point of view than the perspective of the lives of the more powerful. Wood regards all standpoints to be partial, but some are more partial than others. This is because different locations and social hierarchies can affect what we see. With that being said, do all members of a minority group share the same standpoint, and should we just ignore other people's standpoints? Before we answer this, we should apply the standpoint theory to our own lives so we understand what we're working with. Get a pen and a piece of paper and make a chart. On the left will be opinions related to a social group you're part of, and on the right will be opinions from the standpoint of the opposing group. Keep in mind some of the descriptors we just mentioned, so sexual orientation, race, class, gender, things like that. For example, if you're a man, write some opinions about your life as a man in the left column. These could be your opinions on family values, economics, gender roles, etc. On the right, approach those opinions from a female standpoint and consider why they might be different. Go ahead and decide which standpoint of yours you want to approach this from and which opposing standpoint you want to take on. We'll give you some time to complete this. Now that you've applied the standpoint theory to your own life, let's see where this framework came from. In 1807, George Hegel studied master and slave relationships. What they knew about reality depended on which group they were in. Chains, laws, punishment, and childbirth meant different things to both groups. But the group in power, the masters, got to write the history books. They got to determine what reality was. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels viewed things from a proletarian standpoint. They suggested that the impoverished poor, who provide sweat equity, are society's ideal knowers, as long as they understand the class struggle they're involved in. Harding notes that the standpoint theory was a project straining at the bits to emerge from feminist theorists who were familiar with the Marxian epistemology. They had a ready-made framework for standpoint theory when you substitute proletariat for women and class struggle to gender discrimination. George Herbert Mead claimed that culture gets into individuals through communication. On a similar note, Wood suggests that gender is a social construction rather than a biological characteristic. Gender is a system of meanings that sculpt standpoints by positioning most males and females in disparate material, social, and symbolic circumstances. A postmodern critique is embraced by standpoint theorists, and postmodernists applaud the standpoint emphasis on knowledge as locally centered, but they push it to the point where there's no basis for favoring one perspective over the other. Harding and Wood reject this absolute relativism. Standpoint theorists see important differences between men and women. This is based in the relational dialect of autonomy and connectedness. Everyone seeks both, but the preferred amount differs consistently across genders. Men want more autonomy, and women want more connection. Men use speech to accomplish tasks, assert themselves, and gain power. Women use speech to build relationships, include others, and show responsiveness. These differences are a result of cultural expectations and the treatment that each group receives from the other. Culture isn't experienced identically by all of its members. With that being said, not all women share the same standpoint, and neither do all men. Economic condition, race, and sexual orientation are cultural identities that can draw people into the center of society or push them out. An intersection of minority positions creates a highly looked down upon location in the social hierarchy. For example, a poor African American lesbian woman is looked at differently in society as opposed to a rich white, heterosexual man. So what positions do you have? Do you have any intersecting minority positions, and where do they place you? Wood feels that your biology isn't destiny. She fears that championing any singular model of womanhood creates a mold that not all women may comfortably fit. However, solidarity between women is necessary in order to effectively critique the world. If you're on top of the social hierarchy, you're privileged to define what it means to be anything in a given culture. Let's apply this to your own life. Get your pen and paper again and list off some characteristics about yourself. This could be your race, gender, age, anything you think defines who you are. Write down a brief definition of what it means to you to be that thing. What does it mean to you to be a man? What does it mean to you to be a student? Now, write what it means to be that thing from the standpoint of those in power. We'll give you some time to finish this. Do you notice how those definitions might differ? If you listed a minority position, you might notice an even bigger difference in the definitions. Based on what you've learned so far from this chapter, consider why those differences might exist. Compared to you, who's in power? What's their race, their age, their gender? You'll also see that not everyone fits the definition you wrote down because not everyone fits one singular mold and people have different standpoints. Harding says that standpoints are important because the social group that gets the chance to define the important problematics, concepts, assumptions, and hypotheses in a field will end up leaving its social fingerprints on the picture of the world that emerges from the results of that field's research process. Harding and other standpoint theorists insist that there's no possibility of an unbiased perspective that is disinterested, impartial, value-free, or detached from a particular historical situation. Harding's insistence on local knowledge contrasts sharply with the idea of value-free truth. Local knowledge is knowledge that is situated in time, place, experience, and relative power, as opposed to knowledge that is supposedly value-free.
Hey everyone, so the next concept we're going to talk about in the standpoint theory is strong objectivity, which is starting research from the viewpoint of women and marginalized groups in order to well-round your perspective, and so you're not just getting one perspective from the dominant group. So a personal example I thought about to illustrate strong and weak objectivity was in history class in high school when we learned about how Christopher Columbus founded America. He was the first Italian and he brought over spices, riches, and silks. In trying to find a better path to India and China, he ended up at America. And we glorify him as this American hero who first landed here, but we don't talk about what he did to all of the indigenous people when he arrived. We don't talk about how him and his men enslaved, murdered, and raped all of these Arawak women. We only learn one point of history and how America was found from the American viewpoint. We don't talk about the indigenous people, we don't talk about different perspectives, and that's weak objectivity. So take a couple of minutes and think about if you've been a victim of weak objectivity, or have you ever encouraged strong objectivity? I really liked this chapter because it talked about racial and gender biases and the effects that has on gender stereotyping. So the example in the book is talking about how women are given the freedom to be good caretakers, but they're not allowed to have the freedom of putting their work first and still being like a good woman. And then vice versa for men, is that men are given the freedom to make work a priority, but they can't be caregivers because of the stereotype that society has that men can't be caretakers. I think a good example of this is Justin Baldoni. He is a famous actor, and he was talking about how there are no baby changing tables in a man's bathroom, and they're only in like the woman's bathroom because it is stereotyped as the woman is going to change the baby's diaper. But he was saying that he wanted to change his son's diaper and he couldn't do that. I think gendered communication practices definitely reflect our societal expectations. For example, when a president builds part of his campaign saying to grab women by their genitals, What is this communicating to the American people? It's telling people that it's okay to objectify women, it's okay to treat women like that. Okay, so I really like this next concept. It is the standpoint for Black feminist thought. So there are patterns of intersecting oppressions, right? Which is basically an outside view into a privileged society. And so the example in the book, which is not necessarily outdated, but a little bit generalized, is how Black women have ridden buses to their white families where they cooked, cleaned, and executed other domestic duties. And in doing this, they had this outside view into a white society, but they were not a part of that. The African American sociologist who refers to the Black feminist thought standpoint refers to a social location as part of this outsider within. The African American sociologist who came up with the Black feminist thought standpoint talks about the struggles of being an African American woman working in a white society and how that social location puts you at a different spot versus other marginalized populations such as white women or African American men. Obviously, I have no idea what it's like being an African American woman, but the closest personal example I could come up with was being a Asian American female working in a legal field, which is predominantly occupied by white men. Sometimes I don't understand like cultural references. Next, let's talk about interactive universalism. There's this American Turkish philosopher at Yale University who has a theory that a new breed of universal ethics is possible. It would be a moral framework that values diversity and doesn't think that every difference is significant. One critique of interactive universalism is the postmodernist critique, which is basically saying that there are no longer any grand narratives to base a universal truth, which I had an example before with Christopher Columbus, and that was his grand narrative on how we founded America, so I don't necessarily agree with that critique. But the American Turkish philosopher is saying that instead of reaching a consensus on how everyone should act, we should align ourselves to a common good. And I'm not sure I agree with that either, because I think the reason why it's so difficult to reach a consensus on how we should act is because we don't know how to define a common good, right? Like how we deal with immigration in our country. On one hand, we want people in our country to be safe, but on the other hand, we want to encourage diversity and, the melting pot that we are. And so I think because people have differing variations on what the common good is, our philosopher is saying that there should be a concrete collective us in order to achieve a universal brand of ethics instead of having rules imposed on us by rational elites. The feminist critique talks about how a woman's experiences are different than a man. I definitely agree with this critique. For example, my brother and I have grown up the same exact way, but we have very different ways of thinking. So let's critique this standpoint theory. Do standpoints on the margins give a less false view? Some critics of this theory see strong objectivity as inherently contradictory because you can't really evaluate the standpoint of someone else. But then on the other hand, the two authors are saying that the oppressed are less biased and more impartial than the privileged. I definitely agree with standpoint theory in terms of how it says we should question much of the male-dominated Western European research. I don't think we should be spoon-fed knowledge in school and kind of accept that as the truth. I do agree with them in saying that strong objectivity paints a fuller picture of the world that we live in, and I think it's really good to challenge our assumptions and how we view the world. So let us know your thoughts. Let me know what you think about standpoint theory, if it can have it both ways, if you even agree with it. And thank you so much for watching this video.